Eliza stood in front of the bedroom mirror, carefully brushing her thick, dark hair. She knew today was going to be a difficult day. Her husband, Simon, had been suspicious lately. Ever since her ex, Zach, started reappearing in their lives, Simon had been acting strangely, like he was searching for something hidden. But Eliza was careful, very careful. Simon entered the room, holding a cup of coffee. He looked at his wife as if he were trying to see right through her. "Did you meet Zach yesterday?" he asked, with a barely noticeable smile that felt more like a test. "Yes," Eliza replied casually, hiding her nervousness. "We ran into each other at the cafe. He suggested having coffee and catching up. You know we stayed friends after the breakup?" "Aha, friends." Simon stepped closer, as if waiting for her to add something. Eliza took a deep breath and looked at him with feigned sincerity. "Zach is in the past. You know I chose you." Simon nodded, but doubt lingered. He remembered how Zach had acted when they bumped into each other at a party last month. His glances at Eliza were too lingering, his smiles too genuine. But Simon couldn't accuse her without evidence. "Okay," he said shortly, though his voice carried a hint of mistrust. "I just want you to know you can tell me anything." Eliza smiled, pretending everything was fine, though anxiety gripped her inside. She knew she had to be even more cautious because her secret was far more complex than just meeting with her ex. That evening, Eliza received a message. It was from someone Simon had no idea about, Nathan, her secret lover. He worked in the neighboring office and was a true magnet for women. Their affair had started by accident, but quickly turned into something dangerous. "Lunch tomorrow? I can't wait until the weekend to see you," Nathan texted. Eliza quickly deleted the message as soon as she read it and pretended to be replying to a friend. But when she turned back to Simon, she saw him silently watching her from across the table. He said nothing, only gave her a look full of questions. The next day, Eliza went to work. Nathan was waiting for her by the cafe across the street from their office. He looked impeccable as always, black suit, light smile that always had a magical effect on Eliza. "I thought we agreed not to meet on weekdays," she said quietly as she sat down across from him. "I couldn't help it," Nathan shrugged. "You're so beautiful, Eliza. It's torture seeing you at the office and not being able to talk properly." "We're taking risks," she said sternly, but there was a spark in her eyes she couldn't hide. Meanwhile, Simon decided to act. He hired a private investigator to follow Eliza. If she was indeed meeting Zach or anyone else, Simon wanted to know for sure. His intuition rarely failed him. That evening, Eliza returned home, pretending her day had been entirely ordinary. But she noticed Simon seemed more observant, almost cold. "How was work?" he asked, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "Stressful, but nothing special," she replied, trying to sound natural. "You were in the office all day?" Eliza tensed slightly, but quickly composed herself. "Of course. Where else?" "Just asking," he said with a cryptic smile. "You know I trust you." Simon already had the first photos from the detective, but they didn't show Zach. They showed Eliza with a tall blonde man he didn't recognize. They were sitting in a cafe, then entering a nearby hotel. Simon stared at the pictures, unsure of what to do next. He realized one thing. Eliza's secret was much deeper than he had imagined. Simon sat in his workshop, staring at the photographs he had received from the detective. His fingers nervously tapped the table. Who was this man? Why were they meeting? All the answers were hidden behind the fragile facade of Eliza's confidence, and Simon decided to find out more before taking action. The next morning, over breakfast, he acted normal, trying to conceal his unease. Eliza was frying eggs, joking about how her boss couldn't pronounce the word decentralization. She seemed entirely at ease, as if nothing had happened. "Do you have a long day today?" Simon asked between sips of coffee. "Yes, a few meetings, and I might stay late at the office," she replied casually. "Again? You've been staying late a lot lately." "It's report season," she explained, without looking at him. "You know how it is." Simon simply nodded, but his suspicions continued to grow. After breakfast, he decided to visit Eliza's office to check if she was really working there in the evening. On his way to the office, Simon received a message from the detective. He had identified the man in the photos. His name was Nathan Holbridge, and he worked in the same building as Eliza. The name meant nothing to Simon, but the fact that they were meeting made him think. That evening, Simon arrived at the building where Eliza worked. He parked nearby and began watching. Her office floor was nearly empty, but the light in her office was still on. A few minutes later, he saw Eliza leave the building. Her face was calm, her steps confident. She got into her car and drove off, and Simon followed her. He expected her to head home, but her route was different. The car stopped near a restaurant in the city center. Simon parked a little farther away and discreetly entered the restaurant after her. Eliza sat at a table in a cozy corner, but to his surprise, she was alone. Simon tried not to reveal himself. He sat at another table, ordered coffee, and observed. A few minutes later, Zach approached Eliza. He leaned down, hugged her, and sat across from her. Their conversation seemed warm, but nothing suspicious happened. Simon felt the weight of this uncertainty. Zach didn't look like someone hiding something, but why were they meeting? When Eliza and Zach parted ways, Simon quickly paid for his coffee and returned to his car. He decided to keep observing, but to hold off on drawing conclusions for now. The next morning, as he got up, Simon found Eliza's phone on the kitchen table. She had left it at home, and this was an opportunity Simon couldn't pass up. He scrolled through her messages, but found nothing suspicious until he came across a folder of photos. In it were pictures of Eliza with Nathan, laughing, holding hands, and even one kiss. Simon felt his heart clench with pain, but his face remained stoic. He decided it wasn't time to act just yet. That evening, he planned to have a calm conversation with Eliza. During dinner, they discussed mundane topics until Simon asked, "Are you still seeing Zach?" Eliza tensed slightly but kept her voice steady. "Occasionally. We're just keeping things friendly." "That's good. He still seems interested in you," Simon said with a faint smile. Eliza laughed, trying to hide her nervousness. "That's in the past. I have nothing to hide." Simon nodded, but inside, he was boiling. He decided he needed even more evidence to understand everything fully. The next day, Simon decided to be more cautious. He knew his suspicions could tear their marriage apart, but he needed certainty. Pretending that his car needed repairs, Simon asked Eliza if he could take her car to work. She agreed without hesitation. As Simon drove her car, he decided to check the GPS navigation. In the list of recent trips, there were a few unusual addresses. One of them appeared multiple times over the past month, sparking his curiosity. It was the address of an apartment in a neighborhood they had never visited together. Later that day, after work, Simon headed to that address. He parked nearby and stayed in the car, watching. Time passed slowly, but his patience paid off. He saw Nathan exit the building where the apartment was located. Simon's heart raced. Nathan looked relaxed and confident. His movements were unhurried, and the smile on his face was almost provocative. Simon waited until Nathan left, then decided to check out the apartment. On the door was a nameplate with Holbridge on it. This confirmed Simon's suspicions that the place belonged to Nathan. Simon didn't knock or ring the doorbell. He pretended to have lost his keys and simply noted the apartment number. That evening, he returned home and acted as if nothing had happened. Eliza looked slightly tense, but she tried to appear confident. "How was your day?" she asked, serving them dinner. "Fine. I checked your car. It's all good. By the way, do you ever go to Glenview? I saw that address on your GPS and wondered." Eliza froze for a split second but quickly composed herself. "Glenview? Oh, yes, we have a client there. I've been there a few times. Nothing special." "I see," Simon said, hiding his true thoughts. "I was just curious." Over the next few days, Simon dedicated himself to finding out more about Nathan. He hired the same private detective to gather information about him. A few days later, the detective reported back that Nathan was a divorced man working for a company that provided services to office buildings. This meant he had access to the building where Eliza worked. In the meantime, Simon found even more reasons for suspicion. He noticed that Eliza was spending more time in the bathroom with her phone and often seemed distracted during conversations. One evening, she walked into another room to take a call. Simon decided he would check her phone again while she was asleep. In her messages, there was nothing suspicious again, but in her email inbox, Simon found an invoice for a flower delivery sent to Nathan. The letter was dated a few weeks ago. The note read, "Thank you for always being there. E." Simon felt his patience beginning to wear thin. He decided that this time he wouldn't hide his suspicions. The next morning, during breakfast, he asked directly, "Are you still in contact with Nathan?" Eliza flinched and looked at him. Her eyes flashed with panic for a second, but she quickly composed herself. "No, why are you asking?" "Just curious," Simon replied. "I found an invoice for flower delivery, and it wasn't for me." Eliza turned pale. "Simon, it's just gratitude for his help. Nothing more." "Help? With what exactly?" His voice was cold. "It's hard to explain. Nathan helped me with a project at work, and I wanted to thank him." Simon felt a wave of anger rising inside him. "I'm not a fool, Eliza. I don't need your senseless explanations. I want to know the truth. What's going on between you two? And is there someone else?" Eliza looked at him, her eyes beginning to glisten with tears. She remained silent, unsure of what to say. Simon realized she was hiding something, but decided to give her time for now. Simon couldn't sleep all night. He lay in the dark, his thoughts tangled in a maze of suspicion and uncertainty. Something wouldn't let him rest. Suddenly, he had an idea. The next morning, he decided to drop by Eliza's office unannounced. At work, he told his boss he needed a day off due to family matters. Afterward, he drove to Eliza's office. Upon arriving, he parked nearby and entered the building. In the hallway, he heard a familiar voice, Nathan's. He was standing near Eliza's office, talking to her. Their tone was warm, but Simon couldn't hear the words. "Hi," Simon addressed them as he approached. Eliza turned sharply, and Nathan tried to stay composed. "Simon, what are you doing here?" she asked, a bit nervously. "I wanted to surprise you, but it seems the surprise is mine," he said, looking directly into Nathan's eyes. Nathan raised his hands as if in surrender. "Don't worry, man. We were just talking about work." Simon nodded, but distrust was evident in his eyes. "I just wanted to make sure everything was fine." "Eliza, you've seemed a bit tense lately." Eliza stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Everything's fine. Let's talk at home, okay?" Simon agreed, but his suspicions only deepened. That evening, while Eliza was in the bathroom, he decided to check her laptop. An open browser tab showed a hotel booking site. One of the reservations was for that very day, at a hotel nearby. Simon jotted down the address and left the house, telling Eliza he had some errands to run. Arriving at the hotel, he approached the receptionist and, introducing himself, said he was looking for his wife. At first, they refused to give him any information, but seeing the desperation in his eyes, the receptionist eventually revealed the room number booked under Eliza's name. Simon's heart pounded as he took the elevator. On the third floor, he stepped out and walked to the designated room. He stopped in front of the door and took several deep breaths, trying to gather his courage. Finally, he knocked softly. The door was opened by a man Simon had never seen before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with short hair and a self-assured smile. In that moment, everything became clear. "Who are you?" Simon asked coldly, his voice tense. "Could ask you the same," the man replied calmly, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Where's Eliza?" Simon tried to stay calm, but his fists clenched. The man simply shrugged. "She's in the shower. You can wait." Simon felt anger boiling inside him, but he held back from causing a scene. Instead, he took a step back and said, "Tell her I know." Returning home, Simon realized this was the final piece of evidence, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore that his feelings for Eliza hadn't disappeared. He decided to play her game and find out why she was behaving this way. He had a plan, and this time he was sure he would uncover the whole truth. Simon sat in his car outside the house, staring into the darkness. His thoughts swirled like a stormy wind. Why? What had driven her to do this? He felt his love for Eliza turning into a bitter mix of resentment and curiosity. He decided to wait until she returned home. The front door creaked softly as Eliza entered. She stopped when she saw Simon sitting in the living room with a glass of whiskey in hand. "You're already home?" Her voice sounded innocent, but Simon immediately noticed how her gaze briefly darted away. I could ask you the same. His voice was calm but cold. Where were you? Eliza sighed as she took off her coat. I had meetings. You know, work is always busy. At a hotel? Simon asked suddenly, looking directly at her. Eliza froze but quickly regained her composure. What do you mean? Don't play games with me, Eliza. His voice grew sharper. I was there. I saw the room booked under your name. Her face tensed, but she didn't lose her poise. It's for work. We use the hotel for conferences with colleagues. Colleagues like the man who opened the door for me? He raised an eyebrow, keeping his eyes fixed on her. Eliza bit her lip, searching for words. Simon, you're acting paranoid. He was just a client. And Nathan? He asked suddenly, changing the topic. Do you also discuss work matters with him when he looks at you like a predator? Eliza looked flustered, but tried to remain firm. Nathan is just a friend. You know that. Do I? Simon stood up abruptly. Do I know that he follows you around like a dog, and you let him? Eliza stepped closer to him, trying to calm him down. You're misunderstanding everything. I love you, Simon. You're the only one who matters to me. Then why do I keep finding evidence that you're hiding something? His voice trembled with anger and pain. Eliza sighed, looking like she was on the verge of tears. Because you don't trust me anymore. You're looking for problems where there are none. Simon inhaled deeply, trying to calm himself. Maybe you're right. Maybe I am looking for problems. But if I find out otherwise... Eliza replied quietly, You won't, because there's nothing to find. Simon stared at her silently, then walked out of the room, leaving her standing alone with her thoughts. The following days, he continued observing her. Eliza became more cautious, but that only fueled his suspicions. By tracking her phone, he discovered she frequently visited the same location, a small house in the suburbs. Simon decided to investigate. When he arrived, he saw Eliza get out of her car and walk toward the house. She paused, glancing around as if checking to make sure no one was following her, then went inside. Simon decided to wait. An hour later, the door opened, and Eliza stepped out. Following her was the same man Simon had seen at the hotel. They hugged warmly before going their separate ways. Simon decided to enter the house while no one was around. Inside, he found a room filled with photographs and documents. On one of the tables was a note with an address and a date. It was the location of Eliza's next meeting. Simon took pictures of everything and quickly left the house. That night, he sat at his computer, examining the photos. He realized this wasn't just an affair. Eliza was involved in some kind of scheme. The next day, he decided to visit the location written on the note. At the meeting, which took place in a cafe, Simon saw Eliza talking to another man. They were discussing something serious, and her face looked grave. After the meeting, Simon decided to confront the man. Excuse me, he said as the man was leaving the cafe. Do you know Eliza? The man nodded. Yes, and you are? Her husband. Can you explain what's going on here? The man looked uncomfortable, but eventually replied. I'm sorry, but it's better if you discuss this with her. Simon realized things were getting even more complicated. He returned home, ready for a serious conversation. Eliza was sitting in the kitchen, as if waiting for him. I know you've been following me, she said quietly. So let's talk. Simon sat across from Eliza, his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes radiated coldness and caution, but he remained silent, waiting for her to start. She sighed, looking tired but tense, like someone who knew everything might fall apart from here. You saw everything, didn't you? She looked up at him. Everything I needed to see. His voice was quiet, but there was an undercurrent of restrained anger. So, what is it? What are you hiding, Eliza? She rubbed her temples nervously and looked at him as if she were about to say something important. It's not what you think, Simon, she began, but he interrupted her. Oh, I'm sure it's exactly what I think. What were you doing in that house? Who are all these people? And why are you suddenly meeting strangers behind my back? It was for work, she repeated, but her voice sounded weak. There's nothing wrong with it. Then why did you lie? Why didn't you tell me where you were? Simon raised his voice. I saw you with men at the hotel, At the cafe, at that house. I've seen it all, and you're telling me it's just work? Eliza stayed silent for a few seconds, then raised her eyes and said quietly, Simon, I can't tell you everything. It's dangerous. He leaned closer to her, his eyes narrowing. Dangerous? For whom? For you? For me. She exhaled, seemingly deciding to stop hiding something. Listen, there are some things you just can't know. They don't concern you. Simon laughed bitterly, his laugh filled with anger. How nice. I, your husband, am not concerned? You're not even trying to justify yourself. I can't, she said, her voice breaking. It's complicated. Fine, then I'll figure it out myself, he said, standing up. You're obviously not going to tell the truth, but I'll find it out on my own. Simon, wait. She grabbed his hand, her eyes pleading, please don't get involved. It will only make things worse. I don't care. He pulled his hand away from her fingers. If you can't trust me, why should I trust you? He walked out of the house, leaving her sitting in the kitchen. Simon drove through the streets of the city, trying to organize his thoughts. What did her words mean? What danger? And most importantly, what was she hiding? The next day, Simon decided to return to that house. He stood by the roadside when he saw a black car pull up to the building. Two men in expensive suits got out. One of them was carrying a briefcase. They looked too serious for this to be ordinary work. Simon waited a few minutes, then approached the house. The door was locked, but he had a screwdriver he had previously used to open the back door of his garage. He quickly managed to get in and quietly walked inside. The house was empty, but in one of the rooms, he heard voices. Simon moved closer and saw through a small crack that Eliza was sitting at a table with the two men. They were discussing some documents. We can't wait any longer, one of the men said. The money needs to be transferred by the end of the week. I understand, Eliza replied, her voice tense, but it's risky. If anyone finds out, no one will find out if you do everything right, the other man interrupted her. We trust you, but if you fail, the consequences will be serious. Simon was horrified to realize that his wife was involved in some shady deal. But what kind of deal? And why was she hiding it from him? He stepped back, but accidentally knocked over a vase on a table in the hallway. The vase fell with a loud crash, and the voices in the room immediately went silent. Who's there? One of the men called out in a menacing tone. Simon ran for the door, not waiting to answer. He rushed outside and disappeared into the crowd, trying to gather his thoughts. Now he was certain. Eliza was hiding something dangerous, and he needed to figure out what it was before it destroyed their lives completely. Simon felt that something was wrong. He saw it in Eliza's eyes. She was troubled, as if she were hiding a secret and didn't want him to notice. She constantly declined their plans, came home late, and her attitude toward him grew colder. He was sure the problem wasn't him but something else. She had started finding new activities and coming home with a lot of new, unexplained acquaintances. In the evenings, he increasingly found her phone on the table, unlocked, with messages on the screen that she quickly dismissed when he approached. One evening, when she said she was meeting with a friend, Simon couldn't resist. He picked up her phone, opened the messages, and saw the name Adrian. It was the same name he had heard before they got married when Eliza spoke about her ex-boyfriend. Why is this so important to you? Simon thought, reading a message where Adrian asked, When are you free, gorgeous? We haven't seen each other in so long. Simon felt a cold dread rising in his chest, a bitter unease spreading through him. What did this mean? A couple of days later, he stayed home again while Eliza went out for another evening with a friend. Once more, he picked up her phone. This time, he found another message, this one from a man named Ronald. We can't wait any longer. What about your husband? Does he suspect anything? Simon felt his hands trembling. He didn't want to believe what was happening, but he couldn't ignore it either. He decided to act. The next day, he came home early, determined to uncover more. His heart raced as he heard her footsteps approaching the door. But before she entered the room, he left some items on the table and quickly went to the garage. From the hidden camera he had installed a few days earlier, he watched on his phone as she met Adrian near a cafe. They laughed, and then they kissed. Simon's heart cracked. So that's how it is. He thought as he saw Eliza leave the cafe with Adrian. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a conspiracy, a secret she had so carefully hidden. And all of this was happening while he worked hard to be the perfect husband for her. When he returned home, he acted like an ordinary man. Eliza, unsuspecting, asked why he looked so tired. "What's wrong?" she asked, trying to mask the nervousness in her voice. "I'm just thinking," Simon replied. "Tell me more about your friend you've been spending so much time with." She laughed nervously. "You don't trust me, do you?" Her voice was tense, but Simon could sense it was a cover for her insecurity. I'm not sure," he replied, standing across from her. "And here's why. You spend so much time with other people, and I just don't understand anything." Eliza tried to hold his gaze but failed. "It's not what you think, Simon." I don't need to hear more," Simon cut her off sharply. He couldn't hide the pain and betrayal he felt. "This isn't a coincidence. I've seen everything." Eliza fell silent, her eyes filling with tears. She stepped closer, trying to explain, but he wasn't listening anymore. He didn't want to hear her excuses. "You're unfaithful to me," he said quietly, but each word carried the weight of a trial. "And I know who with. Adrian. Ronald. I've seen your messages." Eliza began crying. I did it because of you, because you became so distant." She tried to justify herself, but it didn't matter anymore. Simon, furious and heartbroken at the same time, knew he couldn't continue this marriage. "You can pack your things and leave," he said, walking out of the room. She remained standing there, her eyes full of tears, but she knew there was nothing more she could do to change anything. Eliza sat alone in the empty house, staring at her blurred reflection in the dark window. Her world felt shattered, and Simon's words echoed in her ears. She could no longer make excuses or hide. Despair and anger battled within her soul, but she knew she had nothing left to lose. At the same time, Simon sat at a nearby bar. His friends tried to cheer him up, but he quietly drank and avoided conversation. His thoughts swirled in his head, and he still couldn't decide what to do next. His decision to throw Eliza out had been impulsive, but was it the right one? The next morning, Eliza decided to act. She needed to meet Adrian and figure out if he could help her get out of this situation. She found him at the office where they had met before and immediately noticed the tension on his face. "Eliza, are you crazy?" Adrian grabbed her arm and pulled her aside. "What happened with your husband? Is he following us?" "I don't know, but he knows more than you think," she whispered. "We need to find a way out of this. I can't lose everything." "You've already lost him," Adrian replied coldly. "Now think about yourself." Their conversation was suddenly interrupted by a message Eliza received on her phone. She opened it and froze. It was a photo. Simon with the men in suits she had seen at the house. The message came with a short text. "Looks like your husband knows too much already." Later, Simon continued his investigations. He met one of the men he had seen at the house and carefully hinted that he knew about their dealings with Eliza. The man's reaction surprised him. The man frowned and said, "Your wife can no longer be trusted. If you want to stay safe, forget about her." Simon didn't understand what this meant. He returned home, but he noticed someone had entered his house. On the living room table was an envelope filled with photographs. They were pictures of Eliza with Adrian, Nathan, and several other people. On the back of one of the photos was written, "Want to know the truth? Let's make a deal." Eliza, cornered, decided to reveal everything to Simon. She told him about the years-long scheme Adrian had pulled her into and how she had used Simon as a cover. She cried, but there was no remorse in her eyes. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Simon looked at her with disgust. "We could have solved this together." "You wouldn't understand," she whispered. "It's too dangerous." Simon didn't respond. He had already made up his mind. The next day, he left the house, leaving only a single note on the table. "I will no longer be your cover. Live with the consequences." Eliza realized she had lost not only his love, but also her chance to save herself. She was left alone with her secrets, which had now become her prison. Simon came home late that evening with a folder of photos from the detective in his hand. He opened the door and heard Eliza speaking on the phone. Her voice was soft, almost tender. He froze in the hallway, listening. Yes, I miss you too. No, he doesn't suspect anything. Yes, I'll see you tomorrow, she said before quickly hanging up. Simon walked into the living room, and Eliza flinched when she saw him. You're home already? She asked, trying to hide her panic. Yes. Who were you talking to? Simon asked calmly, deliberately. Jennifer. We were discussing her new job, she replied, turning toward the kitchen. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the photos, and placed them on the table. And this? Was this also a conversation with Jennifer? His voice was as cold as ice. Eliza looked at the pictures, and her face turned pale. Simon, it's not what you think. Then explain, he interrupted her. I want to hear your version. We're just friends, she began, but he cut her off again. Friends? In a hotel? Friends who touch each other like lovers? Friends who lie to their husbands? Eliza sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. I made a mistake, she said through her tears. Simon stood motionless, watching her. He gathered his thoughts, though emotions raged inside him. This wasn't a one-time thing, he said, more of a statement than a question. How long has this been going on? Eliza was silent for a moment before answering. 6 months. Simon shook his head, looking at her with pain in his eyes. And why? Why did you do it? I don't know. I felt like something had changed between us. Adrian gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time, she admitted, avoiding his gaze. You have no idea what it's like to hear that, Simon said. But now I know the truth. He turned and walked to the bedroom, leaving Eliza alone with her thoughts. The next morning, while Eliza was still asleep, Simon went to see a lawyer to start the divorce process. But first, he decided to confront Adrian. Simon found him at the cafe where he and Eliza often met. He sat across from him without saying a word. Adrian looked up and saw him. And who are you? Adrian asked, though his expression was wary. I'm Simon, Eliza's husband, he replied calmly. Adrian tried to smile, but his eyes betrayed unease. I don't think this is a good idea. I know everything. So I just want to know one thing. Why? Adrian leaned forward, folding his hands. Sorry, but that's none of your business. Simon smiled, but his eyes burned with anger. Then I'll make it my business. You knew she had a husband, but you didn't care. Now, not only are you losing her, but you also have bigger problems. Adrian frowned. What problems? Simon pulled out his phone and showed him the messages the detective had uncovered from Eliza. They included mentions of Adrian's business and the money he had funneled through Simon's accounts. The police will be investigating this, Simon said. And if you don't want to end up in prison, you'd better start talking. Adrian paled but said nothing. Simon stood up and added, It's your choice, but I won't let you two ruin my life anymore. He walked out, leaving Adrian alone with the mess he had created. Simon drove home from the cafe, thinking about how his life had completely changed in just a few days. Eliza's betrayal hurt, but her lies and dragging him into financial schemes hurt even more. It felt like the end, but deep inside, another plan was forming. He decided to take the upper hand. When Simon entered the house, Eliza was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea. She looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept all night. Seeing him, she immediately started talking. Simon, we need to talk. He sat across from her, keeping a calm expression. All right, start. Eliza sighed. I know I made a huge mistake, but please, don't destroy everything. I'll fix this. Adrian won't be part of our lives anymore. Simon smiled, but it was a cold smile. You still don't understand that this isn't just about him. She looked up, surprised. What do you mean? Adrian told me more than you think, Simon lied, trying to catch her reaction. I know about your financial schemes. Eliza turned pale, but quickly tried to justify herself. It was his idea. I just wanted to help us financially. Simon leaned forward, his voice low and threatening. And you decided to do that by deceiving me? Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Eliza began to cry, trying to convince him of her sincerity. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please, give me a chance to make things right. Simon silently stared at her. In his mind, he was already piecing together his plan. The next day, he went to see a lawyer. He requested that divorce papers be prepared and that all her access to their accounts be blocked. At the same time, Simon instructed his private detective to find out more about Eliza's connections with Adrian. The detective called back within hours. There's something interesting. Adrian is working with other women, using them as tools for fraud. In your case, he was trying to use Eliza to get access to your assets. That's already clear to me. What else? Simon asked. It seems he still has documents she signed. If you want to close this case, you'll need to get those papers. Simon knew it was time to act. That evening, he met Adrian again. But this time he didn't come alone. He brought the detective to document everything. You know why I'm here, Simon said, sitting across from him. Adrian looked calm, but his eyes betrayed his anxiety. I thought we already talked. No, now I want you to hand over all the documents she signed. Otherwise, I'll make sure you end up behind bars. Adrian smiled nervously. And how exactly will you do that? Simon called over the detective, who handed him a recorder with the previous conversation. This is enough for the police to start a case, Simon said. Adrian clenched his jaw, realizing he was caught. Fine, I'll hand over everything. Just leave me alone. They agreed to meet the next day, where Adrian handed over all the documents. Now Simon had the evidence he needed to protect himself from further problems. When Simon returned home, Eliza was waiting for him. She looked unsettled. I saw you meeting with him. What were you doing? She asked. Simon calmly looked at her. Protecting myself. Something you never did. Eliza started to speak, but he raised his hand to stop her. I've already decided. I'm filing for divorce. She froze, unsure of what to say. Her eyes filled with tears. Simon, please. We can fix this. No, Eliza. You destroyed our life. And I don't want to be part of your chaos anymore. He walked past her, leaving her standing in the empty room where she realized she had lost everything. A few months later, Simon had started a new life. His business recovered, and he learned to trust only himself. He realized it was better to be alone than with someone who betrayed him. Eliza, on the other hand, was left alone, having lost not only her husband but also her reputation. Her involvement in Adrian's fraud became known, and her life was never the same again. Simon sat in his dark study, going through the documents he had received from Adrian. His hands still trembled with anger. Eliza had betrayed him not only as a wife, but also as a partner, attempting to involve him in a scheme that could have left him with nothing. However, instead of succumbing to despair, he decided to use the situation to punish her in a way she could never expect. The next morning, Simon met with his lawyer and private detective. We'll freeze all her accounts and make sure she doesn't get a single dollar from the divorce, the lawyer said. But there's another option if you want to take this further. Tell me, Simon replied, his voice cold as ice. We can hold her legally accountable for the fraud. If you agree, we'll submit the documents to the authorities, and this will be the beginning of the end for her. Simon thought for a moment. He wanted Eliza to feel what it was like to lose everything. At home, Eliza acted as though nothing had happened. She tried to be cheerful, cooked dinner, and even asked about his day. How was your meeting? She asked over dinner. Great, Simon replied. We discussed a new project. By the way, how was your day? Eliza smiled nervously. It was fine. I thought we could spend more time together this weekend. Simon barely held back a smirk. That's a great idea. I even know where we could go. Eliza beamed, thinking he was beginning to forgive her. The next day, Simon made sure to set his plan in motion. He contacted people who could corroborate Eliza and Adrian's fraudulent activities. All the evidence was collected and handed over to the proper authorities. But Simon decided to add a final touch. That evening, he invited Eliza to dinner at an upscale restaurant to end the game on his terms. I think we should start over, he said, sitting across from her with a glass of wine. Eliza looked moved. I'm so glad you're willing to give us a second chance. But there's one condition, he added, leaning in closer. What is it? She asked, slightly wary. I want you to tell me the truth. About everything. Why did you do it? Eliza lowered her eyes. I felt lonely, Simon. You were so busy with work, and I wanted more attention. Adrian offered to help with finances, and I thought it would be good for both of us. Simon leaned back in his chair. Even now, you're not telling the truth. But it doesn't matter anymore. Eliza looked at him, confused. What do you mean? You'll find out very soon. Their conversation was interrupted by two men in suits who approached their table. Mrs. Eliza, we're from the Financial Investigations Department. You'll need to come with us. Eliza turned pale. What? This must be a mistake. Simon calmly took a sip of his wine and said, No, it's not a mistake. You know what you did, and now you'll pay for it. Eliza turned to him, her eyes filled with panic. You did this? How could you? How could I? His voice was steady and cold. You destroyed our life, Eliza. You betrayed me, lied to me, and used me. I just made sure you got what you deserved. Eliza was led out of the restaurant, her protests and screams fading into the background. Simon sat at the table, watching as she disappeared through the doors. He no longer felt pain or anger. Instead, there was only relief. His revenge was complete, and he knew it was the right decision. Now he could start fresh, free from the lies and betrayal that had poisoned his every day. So, what did a man do when he found out that his wife not only cheated on him but also involved him in a fraudulent scheme? He made sure she faced the full consequences of her actions, leaving her to deal with the fallout while he reclaimed his life.